What's up, ego hackers? Welcome to C.S. Joseph Podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph. And today we're going to be discussing the most important female choice a woman can make, which is insanely important. That decision is basically who to give her virginity to. Who and when. Very important decision, but we're going to talk about it from a psychological perspective. The more men that women have sex with, the less they are able to pair bond. This is proven, okay? This is why a woman, when they are born with value, they're born with beauty. And men, when they're born, they are born with no value. They have to create value and build value their whole lives. Women are just given value by default. And so because of that, they have to preserve their value. This is why a woman who does not have sexual history is far more attractive to men than women who do have sexual history. And likewise, a man who has no future, or looks like he has no future, that man is not attractive. But the man who does have a future and a lot of potential for a future, he's the one who is the most attractive. You can actually look at this and see how this plays out in high school teenage dynamics for relationships. Because the popular boys in high school, the popular kids, they're the ones who look like, outwardly, they're the ones who have the best potential for a future. And that's why all the girls get with them, because they have attractive futures. And it's so critical. It's so critical to understand how this dynamic works. But here's the thing. Let's say, you got a daughter, she's in high school or whatever, she's still a virgin. Definitely got to have a conversation and talk to her about these gender dynamics. Because the more men that are inside of her, basically, the more likely that no man's ever actually going to commit to her. Women need to be taught at a young age, especially when they become sexually aware. They need to be taught. It's like, hey, how should I put it? When they're giving up their virginity, for example, it's like they're permanently imprinted with that man. They are permanently imprinted to the point that every man that a woman has sex with, especially at first, she remembers him. And then she has this thing where she will compare him to other men. And this sexual history ends up becoming a problem because men in general, psychologically, do not like competing with those other men who are in her head. This is why the most attractive woman is the woman who has a clean slate, a clean history. Another principle that needs to be taught to your daughters is like, hey, when it comes to commitment versus sexuality, the commitment versus sexuality model, women control access to sexuality. They're able to say yes or no to a man based on whether or not she's going to have sex with him, okay? They control access to sexuality. And that includes her ultimate sexual choice, the man that she marries, the man that she gives up her virginity to, right? Okay, that's mega important. It's critical. However, your daughters need to be taught that men control access to commitment. And so if a woman has a sexual history of even above 2, that woman is very not likely to gain the commitment of a man, at least not a valuable one. Oftentimes, if you look at the women who have the largest sexual histories, what ends up happening is that the men that they end up getting with are losers. They're weak. They don't have very much future potential. So the more future potential a man has, the lower the sexual history of a woman. And these things are relative to one another. If a man's future potential is lower, that means a woman's sexual history and the amount of men who have been inside of her is higher. okay? This is consistently true all across the board. This is irrefutable. This is fact. This is psychological innately to mankind. You can't get around it. So you got to teach your daughter how, because men control access to commitment, they are always in the position of power. And they will always have positions of power within society. No amount of feminism in this world will change that concept, because men control access to commitment. Sometimes I've been criticized by women in my life who couldn't imagine why or how I married some, plain Jane looking pick-me girl, but she's a virgin. And I married a virgin. And then while most women would consider her a plain Jane pick-me girl, I built her. And I made her, I created an astounding beauty. One of the most beautiful women who walk the earth. Because I led her into it, right? She's a tabula rasa. She's a clean slate. And I molded her into something great, right? And continue to mold her every day into something great. This is how it works. This is how men are. They'll sleep with the hot chick, but they'll marry the cute girl. Okay? That's the thing. And this is where it really matters. This is where you really need to pay attention. You should go get my course at school.com/CSJoseph. SKOOL.com/CSJoseph. And specifically, Season 40, How to Personality Type Yourself and Others. Okay? Personality type your daughters. Be good fathers to your daughters. Explain to her compatibility. You get the Season 42 course, which is about compatibility. You can explain to her about compatibility and how that works, and how she should save herself for a compatible man, and teach her the concept of commitment versus sexual commitment access versus sexual access, commitment versus sexuality, and explain this to her so she understands the consequences of her sexual actions, so she doesn't end up in this endless cycle of men sleeping with her but not committing to her. And also to understand, if you're a hot chick, okay, hot chicks versus cute girls, that can be a thing. And how, like, for example, if she's subconscious developed, she's more likely to be the hot chick that's ran through by double digits of men being inside of her, statistically speaking, versus the cute girl who's typically unconscious developed. And usually the unconscious developed women are the ones who maintain their virginity or have the lowest sexual histories compared to their emotionally explosive, subconscious developed counterparts. And guess what? You would be able to teach this to your daughter, but you'd have to get my course content and understand exactly how and why that works and why it's important. Okay? Because that's my biggest criticism of fathers these days, is that they do not know how to teach these sexual gender dynamics to their daughters, because they are entirely ignorant of them. And, it's a big deal. And women need to be taught about sex early. They need to be taught about it really early. These conversations need to happen. I remember, my father attempting to, do a birds and the bees discussion with me on my wedding day, even though I was already sexually active. And this happened when I was 19 years old. It was really embarrassing. Especially, in my entire childhood upbringing, I only knew that my parents had sex, one time because they hid it for so long. And most people think that this is healthy. I'm here to say that ain't healthy. That is not healthy at all. At all. Because what ends up happening is that if your children are not aware that their parents have a sexual relationship and what that means and what that is, what ends up happening is that they end up lacking the language to describe what is happening, such that an abuser could enter into their life and could sexually abuse them as children. Okay? And guess what? That's what happened to me. And I didn't even really become conscious of my parents' sexuality until I was like 13 or 14 years old. And this also opened me up to having a higher risk of, getting addicted to pornography, because we never actually talked about sex. It just never happened. It's one of my parents' biggest failures, and definitely something that I would encourage other parents to not fail at. So, for example, you have children, and then you're in the bedroom and you're making love in the bedroom. Yeah, it can get noisy or whatever, doors closed, all that. And then all of a sudden, you come out later, have dinner, and then all of a sudden your children ask you questions. What was going on in there, right? This gives you, the parent, the opportunity to discuss with your children what that means, give them the language. That way, if there is a sexual predator about or whatever, they will be able to say no, and they'll be able to describe things, especially if abuse does take place. They'll be able to describe to the adults in their life what the abuse actually was. I have a really horrible memory as a 5-year-old. And when I was first abused by a family member sexually, but they claimed later, oh, that's just kid stuff. Okay, yeah, whatever. They're older than me, whatever. And it was like the first memory I have of me lying to my mother, like ever. And that happened on the following day, and then I was covering it up, basically. No different than Adam and Eve covering up what they did by using trees and branches to, cover up their sexual organs or whatever in the Garden of Eden, etc., that kind of a thing. So, but my point is that parents, you need to talk about these topics with your children to protect them. Not just protecting them from abuse in childhood, but also protect them from irresponsible sexual decisions, okay, in their adulthood. That is critical. And we live in this society where it's just not talked about. It's way too taboo to talk about. And when I was young, I thought to myself that it probably wouldn't be more taboo than it already is, but it is even more taboo than it already is. Especially with the prevalent high amount of fatherlessness that happens consistently. Okay? That's a thing. Right? And if you're a father, if you're a dad, if you have children, this is your responsibility. And it's pathetic to me that most subconscious developed men are too pussy to approach these topics with their children just by virtue of themselves being uncomfortable to talk about it. Because they often don't. And it's pathetic to me. And it's disgusting, because they are literally setting their children's lives up for failure in the future. It's a big problem. This is why parents need to be able to understand the points of view of children compared to their own points of view through proper psychoanalysis, and be able to meet them in the middle and discuss hard topics like this topic with them, especially your daughters. Especially your daughters. Okay? This is critical. They don't know the consequences of their actions. Recently, a friend of mine, his daughter, he caught his teenage daughter, having sex and sneaking sex at home with some random schoolboy, basically. He sent the schoolboy off, and this irreparably damaged their relationship. She actually got ragey and called the police on him, and that could have landed him in really big trouble, even though he did nothing wrong. Really bad situation, right? And this is literally because, as an SD man, he had this perception that, she's my little angel, all this, right? These SD men, they really don't like their fake heavens blown up. But the reality of the situation is his daughter went that far. Who knows how many other men have already been with her? Who knows what her body count is? Who knows what her sexual history is? And who knows how much damage she has done to being able to secure a healthy, committed relationship later in life. And she did this as a teenager, and it's completely wasted. That should be something that fathers, and especially if you're a stepfather, not a big fan of the idea of stepfathers, because single moms and their children should be taken care of by the church, in my opinion. But, if you're in the fatherly role towards a female child, it's your job. It is your job to take responsibility in this area and explain the consequences of her actions to her. But before she takes those actions, she has to understand how important it is. You can even go so far as to use an example like Chris Evans, right? Who doesn't like Chris Evans? Chris Evans is awesome, okay? Chris Evans, like where you tell your daughter, it's like, look, you got to protect this part of you. Your virginity, protect your virginity. You got to protect this part of you. You really, really do. Because, for example, if you start racking up a sexual history, you're not going to be able to secure a commitment from the best of men out there. Well, there's another perspective. It's like, hey, just you being chaste, what ends up happening, it vastly increases the chances that you'll actually get the highest quality man. You don't have to have this pressure of trying to become a supermodel, because most girls assume in order to get the best men, they got to look like a supermodel. That is actually false and has been proven false many, many times. Look at Chris Evans, okay? Chris Evans is a really good example. He married a Starbucks barista, okay? That's what he did. A girl like that. He did not marry a supermodel, okay? He didn't. And Chris Evans is an extremely high-value man, very high-value man. And, you as a father could use this example to show your daughter, like, hey, you don't have to be like some kind of Victoria's Secret bitch. You can actually just be you, and you'll get a man like Chris Evans. You will. Because you're chaste. Because chastity matters. And here's why it matters. And you tell them about the commitment versus the sexuality model. Men control access to commitment. That's why they will always have power over women and power in society. Because a man does not have to be committed. And at any moment, a man could potentially end his commitment. And this is why with women, while they do control access to sexuality, they need to control that access so that it's only one. There's a concept that I teach in the school, behind the school paywall. And that is that mentally, women only have enough mental space in their heads for a compatible relationship. One compatible relationship. All right? They have that. Men have a lot of mental space for a lot of compatible relationships. Women have mental space for a lot of camaraderie relationships. Okay, and I explain why behind the paywall. But men only have room for one camaraderie, maybe two camaraderie relationships in their lives, which is basically men who are similar or the same type as themselves. Okay? That's what that means. All right? So this is why a woman's virginity, psychologically speaking, and her chastity, psychologically speaking, has extreme value. Yeah, it has extreme value. It is insanely important because she only has enough room in her head for a relationship with a compatible male. And you want your daughter to have a relationship with a compatible male because that relationship is going to last. If you put your daughter or allow your daughter to be in an incompatible relationship, it's going to spell disaster for your future. And you lazy, good-for-nothing, weak, subconscious developed men who continue to allow that environment to happen because you're either too scared or too ignorant to have these conversations with your daughters, you are utterly failing them and you are setting them up for failure. And the only people you have to blame is yourself. At least somewhat unconscious developed men who end up having way more sexual relationships with women than SD men do statistically, because that higher amount of experience, even if they are ignorant, they could still give really, really good advice compared to subconscious developed men when all these parties are ignorant of Jungian analytical psychology. But Jungian analytical psychology, personality typing, octogram, and compatibility is the shortcut to try to be able to establish a way to communicate with your children, especially your daughters, about these concepts. It is absolutely critical. So, critically, understand that. Understand that. Think about it. Realize it is your responsibility as men to actually pull this off. Otherwise, you will find your daughters falling victim to losers, incapable men, and men who have no future. And as a result, your grandchildren will be severely, severely harmed by basically their childhood and their lack of proper teaching in this area. So anyway, folks, thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you all on the next episode.